Welcome back to Digital Foundry for this, the 205th edition of DF Weekly, our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. Lots going on this week, lots to wade through. Joining me on the panel, first of all, Oliver McKenzie.
Yes, hi Rich, here to talk about the latest in Microsoft leaks and big news Sony games. Should be fun.
Absolutely. And of course, Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, another round of Microsoft leaks. It seems like it's a very common thing that happens at Microsoft. I wonder why.
Anyway, let's get straight to it. Okay, first news topic of the week. We are going to be talking about Microsoft leaks, specifically news of what has been described as the Project Kennan Xbox handheld. Essentially, think of this as an OEM handheld design put together by Microsoft that it can license out to the likes of Asus, Lenovo, etc. And it does seem to be that the first product will be with Asus. And the details on this, well, it seems to be we're actually going to get to see what an Xbox shell looks like on a PC, in this case, a handheld PC. And obviously, our man with the most experience of handheld PCs is, of course, Oliver McKenzie. So I'm really interested in your opinions on this and what form this will actually take. And bearing in mind that Microsoft are intent on producing their own handheld, what's the point of this endeavor?
Yeah, I definitely have some questions about that latter part. But the basic contours of this seem to basically be like that mooted Windows, Xbox hybrid kind of interface device, running Windows, looking like Xbox, behaving like Xbox, that kind of thing. That makes a lot of sense from my perspective. It sounds kind of a lot like Steam Big Picture Mode or SteamOS. You basically have an end-to-end interface that would work for most gaming tasks, and then you'd still have the Windows desktop, presumably, for anything that required like more advanced tweaking or downloading or maybe alternative stores, things like this. You'd have that functionality presumably available through Windows still. But for me, right now, the benchmark for this kind of experience is the Steam Big Picture Mode. Right now, my desktop PC, which I use in TV configuration, is booted right into Steam Big Picture Mode, and that covers most use cases, I think, with controller-friendly games. They still have various issues with like launchers crashing or not being cooperative with controllers. Any kind of settings work you need in Windows obviously does not work with just the Steam Big Picture Mode. Anything that involves the Xbox app or Ubisoft app or EGS or Battle.net, that's not so good. I've also had some issues with the controller interface with the store, which sometimes doesn't respond well to controller input there. But most of those issues are fixed in SteamOS. So to me, basically there would be like two levels to this. You know, number one, can Microsoft beat Steam Big Picture within Windows? Because that is kind of providing a kind of analogous experience here. And number two, can they beat SteamOS? I think they really need to be able to like get in there with Steam's Big Picture Mode in terms of delivering a smooth end-to-end experience with hopefully not too many compromises, but certainly if they were able to get it closer to that SteamOS level where it really is an integrated interface for all manner of adjustment, that would certainly be much better here. And of course, you need to remember, like, the timelines on here are maybe not so favorable to Microsoft. They're talking about this machine potentially coming out in late 2025 or even 2026. That's a period where you're going to have quite a few SteamOS devices, I presume, on the market. Obviously, the Steam Deck itself, various Bazzite forks, or maybe even a full third-party generic version of SteamOS that you could run on any device. That seems to be in the picture as well. So that seems like a bit of a dangerous combination to come up against. And then, of course, if they don't have good Steam integration for people, I think a lot of this effort might be a bit of a non-starter, because obviously the beauty of SteamOS is that it's built around the largest gaming platform on PCs, period. And this maybe would not be that. Hopefully it would have some good integration with Steam. That would really kind of be a prerequisite, I think, for this to work out well. So ultimately, I have somewhat mixed feelings about coupling Windows with this kind of interface, but I think, you know, Microsoft definitely hopefully has the capability to pull it off here. And there are a decent number of games that won't run on Steam Deck or won't run well on Steam Deck owing to translation issues with Proton. Obviously, you have anti-cheat problems with multiplayer games. This effort would presumably sidestep all those issues. That is a big, big win for Microsoft potentially if the rest of the operating system can be contorted into a form that would work with controllers here. But I mean, ultimately, I think one final question here would be just with respect to this particular effort, because like you mentioned, Rich, this is an Asus exclusive effort, or at least Asus is potentially the first firm involved in such an effort here. And I kind of wonder, like, would it be the same Zen processors we've seen so far? Would it be the Strix Point APU? Would it maybe even be the Zen Z2 Go APU, which is a Rembrandt-based APU? I don't know. That does not sound super exciting to me from a performance perspective. Now, if this was based on a custom chip or something, that would be a lot more exciting and potentially quite tantalizing. But I think probably this initial effort will just be with that kind of off-the-shelf part here. And I think ultimately, like, what I'd like to see from a Windows handheld would be something that's led by Microsoft that maybe has a custom chip that has an additional level of power in it that can kind of push beyond this spec that we've seen for the past 3 years, with every device in the 15-watt range kind of settling in at plus or minus 20% Steam Deck performance. That'd be an area of interest for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a lot to go through. I'm going to go to Alex first, though, before I pick that apart.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to echo everything Oliver said. I think this could lead to a good way to unify the access to settings in Windows in a way that is more controller friendly. Microsoft has had historical problems with this you can go into Windows and there's still things stuck in the control panel. There's still things stuck in settings. You type in the search bar, something from the settings and it doesn't show up. You have to go to settings manually. It's just a mess, right? If this could also be a way to get unified Windows UI interactions to actually start working again, I'd be grateful. But to the point at hand, I think actually this Project Kennan is going to be a bit, not from the exact same way it's done on the Sony side, but I think it's almost like Microsoft's PS5 Pro in the aspect of it is testing the waters and going to be used as a beta testing platform for what they're doing with the next Xbox. All the UI stuff, the sideways integration with Steam that has been already mentioned by Phil Spencer in the past, as well as just mentioned by Oliver. All of these, these things that are going to be teething points and points where you need kind of like open beta testing from an audience, like the flighting, as they call it at Microsoft, I think. This is what this product, I think, is actually going to be very useful for them. And it's also going to see exactly how does this fit into the legacy catalog of PC gaming. Unlike the Xbox handheld, which is probably going to come out later than this, maybe 2027, this one will not have the Xbox integration in terms of like you carry your library with you, right? In the way that we expect with an Xbox branded product. This one is presumably just going to have like Xbox Anywhere, I think it is called, like the streaming capability, as well as any other things you might have already had on the Microsoft Store, including your third-party things, purchased through Steam and EGS and such. So it's not going to be the exact same thing as following the PS5 route, but I think that's exactly what this Project Kennan is. It is a testing grounds for the further development of what this next Xbox ecosystem is going to be, which is going to be much more like a PC and much more like the Windows ecosystem we've seen in the past, just hopefully with a lot more intuitive controls and also just extractable performance that is not going to make you tear your hair out. I really think if Microsoft is pushing this thing, they need to do exactly what Steam does, where there's like controller profiles downloading with your games and stuff. They need the equivalent of GameScope to run really well. The Microsoft Game Bar is okay, but once again, it could be better. the ability to like frame rate limit and do all these things that you have with GameScope, integrated FSR, a whole bunch of other features there that are really, really good. I think that's something that Microsoft needs to bring over to the PC space, because currently that's filled by third-party tools in the PC landscape, which are all plugging into Windows API calls. It feels like they could do that on their own and perhaps do it better in a way that doesn't require the mouse and keyboard to work. So there's a lot that I feel like this product could represent. But like Oliver, I'm very curious about the technological underpinnings of it. If it is really performance-wise a lot like just this plus or minus 20% Steam Deck that Oliver just said, it doesn't actually sound too interesting. It has to also maybe have some good hardware oomph there to make it sound more interesting, as well as a sleep button, like a good sleep button. That's something Steam has. The Steam Deck is awesome for that aspect. If you try sleeping games in Windows, good luck. If you've ever tried it, it's not usually a good thing. So that would be another thing that they would have to work on, Windows sleep functionality. which hasn't been touched in a long time.
Okay, so where do we begin with this? Well, from my perspective, let's first of all talk about why they're doing it when they've got their own handheld coming in a couple of years. And I think it's simply because, first of all, they need to solve the problem of Windows being able to be used as a console-style operating system. And part of the interface is obviously a key issue for it, but there's a lot more to it, like, system software updates, that kind of thing. How are you going to install those third-party stores unless you plug in a mouse and keyboard and do it, the manual way? That's my main issue with PC gaming on a handheld at the moment, is that kind of like a USB hub with a mouse and keyboard are kind of like essential for setting everything up. Yeah. And then you're kind of good to go. There's a lot going on there. And as you say, Alex, you look at SteamOS and what it's doing in terms of bridging the gap between what a console is and what a PC is. And Gamescope is an excellent example of that, because it's doing a lot of great PC-style stuff that I think high-end users would probably want on an Xbox. In theory, it should just be plug and play, right? But when you start verging it into the PC area, you've got to have PC style features. I think. I think fundamentally the interface will just look like an Xbox, like an Xbox Series X, fundamentally, with extra bits added on. The concept of unifying your game libraries. An early solution to that is probably just simply some kind of unified launcher. I don't foresee Microsoft allowing you to buy Steam games from within their shell. That would be kind of like counterintuitive, I think. In terms of why they're doing it, I think it is simply that, maybe I always I was going to say this could be a reaction to the Lenovo SteamOS device, right? The thing is, though, the industry doesn't react that quickly. Products don't just magically appear out of thin air, with the possible exception of like the 1070 Ti back in the day.
Where did that come from?
Vega came along, and it was great. And so Nvidia just sort of like stripped back the 1080 a bit and called it a 1070 Ti. Very easy to do in that sense, but from this, I don't think this sort of strategy, this kind of ability to put together that interface, associating with whoever the partner is, ASUS or whatever. There have been rumblings about Microsoft providing OEM hardware for well over a year at this point. So I think it was always going to happen, but I do think that Steam Deck was a catalyst. And I do think that Microsoft saw it and thought, well, what if they start to encroach into our Windows space? This is problematic. Hardware-wise, let's talk about that. Could go one of two ways. If it is an OEM device that Microsoft is basically licensing out, there is potential for some customization, right? However, to create custom silicon is not actually a cheap endeavor. It requires a lot of money. And if AMD already has off-the-shelf solutions that will do the job, it's probably the best way forward. Which one? Well, tricky, right? You'd really want Strix Point, which would be the latest and greatest. But even then, what for what, it's not a generational leap over Steam Deck. You have to kind of, similar to the Asus ROG Ally and Z1, Z2 Extreme, you're going to need to throw more power at it to get more performance, a lot more performance. I'm not sure that's what Microsoft would want. If it is, was it, Oliver, the Z2 Go?
Z2 Go is Rembrandt.
Yeah, which is basically what, a 6800U?
Yeah.
Which is okay. It is faster than Steam Deck. But again, you need to throw more power at it to get that extra performance. 15 watt versus 15 watt is extremely unimpressive. It's really, really interesting that they're doing this. And I think it is because they probably do need a proving ground, as you say, Alex. Mm-hmm. But my expectations are kind of tempered as to what it's going to be. I honestly think that if you're putting out an Xbox that doesn't run Xbox games, for example, the 360 back-compat stuff, I think that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Because you want your digital library to run on your Xbox, really. Let's take some supporter questions on this. This one from Anxiously Chronoed figured, "Hi DF crew, we've all now heard of Xbox Kennan the Barbarian." I think 2025 would be too soon to release it for Microsoft, as there wouldn't be any hardware advantage over other handhelds. I mean, it would be great to see FSR4 working on the device. What do you think, gentlemen? Cheers! ! Yeah, I mean, you'd love to see FSR4. Either you'd need a back-ported version of FSR4 that runs on RDNA 3, or you would need a new APU that runs RDNA 4.
Yeah.
And even then, there are problems, I think, in terms of its computational cost. This one from Rave_Damos, all in block capitals. Dear Digital Foundry Fellows, I have 2 questions, if that's allowed. I'll allow it.
Yeah, might as well.
According to Jez Corden, Microsoft is reportedly working on Windows updates that add an Xbox software shell for PC gaming, likely compatible with various hardware. Conceivably, this shell would work on existing devices like the ROG Ally 2. Thoughts? I'd say yes. If they're putting out an OEM Xbox, unless there's some sort of hardware differentiation, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't run on pretty much any APU based handheld system, and I think that's fine. And I think Microsoft would actually welcome that. The more people that are running an Xbox-like experience from their perspective, the better. It's all ties into this. This is an Xbox beat that they're putting out there. Perchance, Rich. I love the way that people sort of adopt like
Victorian
for language whenever they address me in questions. Perchance, Rich, does Digital Foundry plan coverage of the Asus Xbox branded PC handheld rumored to arrive later this year? Given the hardware is likely the same or marginally derivative of ROG Ally hardware, would the focus be on the software user experience rather than just performance? Absolutely, right? Because, this is the big problem Microsoft's got. It hasn't got a handheld experience that works, really. Windows is really not good. What's this question here? I've got one more here from Diehard X86. Sounds like a really great YouTube channel.
It is.
Anyway, speaking on the OEM collab Xbox branded handheld, I'm a bit confused why Microsoft would release another handheld SKU instead of just updating the current ROG Ally / Legion Go. I mean, I don't see why they can't do that. Why do you think they are doing this? Windows Central Jez Corden mentioned it being a test bench for their future hardware efforts, but couldn't they get the same data from currently available handhelds? Thanks. I think it's all about this OEM program and whether it's going to work. And if it is actually Microsoft hardware that's being licensed, that's probably going to be one thing they're going to do in future with their quote unquote actual handheld. And similarly, it doesn't really matter if you're running this OS on other handhelds. The more the merrier, right? Any final thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is probably some merit to having a dedicated device with like a proper Xbox button. That's nice to have. Maybe a more pronounced grip, something like that. Inching more in the direction of something that's distinctively Xbox there. That could be part of it. Also, it's just maybe easier to launch in one device with one chipset to start with. Maybe they've got some special sauce in terms of that chipset, in terms of, something new. I guess that could be some potential there. Yeah, maybe something. I don't know. Unlikely, but perhaps they have something interesting from the hardware perspective that would justify moving over. But I'd also presume that this would be available for PCs to use generally and handhelds to use in particular as well, other handhelds.
Yeah, I agree on that. And yeah, they have Auto SR, of course, which I think would be an absolutely fine addition to have to a handheld based on it showing on the Qualcomm Snapdragon X Elite Surface. Yeah, some sort of all-in-one style upscaler for any game. There's certain value to that. I wonder if it could be backported to existing AMD hardware that does have an MPU in it. That's certainly an interesting thought.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts for you on this one, Alex?
Oh, I was just imagining like a handheld with like a pistol grip on it when Oliver was talking about it. It would fit really well into the gamer aesthetic. Pistol grip, sight rails, hollow sight on it. You can imagine what it would look like.
Okay. Let's move on quickly. Okay, our next news story of the week. Well, it turns out that Death Stranding 2 is going to be releasing later this year, June, I believe. And a pre-order trailer was released. And holy crap, it looks really, really good. Oliver, you insisted that this was discussed in this particular episode of DF Direct, and it does look absolutely amazing, right?
Yeah, insistent is perhaps an overstatement, but I do think we should definitely talk about it this week because I thought it looked quite beautiful. First of all, this trailer is apparently captured on PS5. It's not totally clear, at least the cinematic parts, because the specific wording is the in-game cinematics are captured on PS5, and that it's a mix of gameplay and cinematics. That leaves the gameplay side of things a little bit up for debate and up for question, but at least the cinematics are captured on PS5 there, presumably in real time. And I think those cinematic scenes look absolutely stunning. Like, I'm pretty confident these are some of the best directed, best looking cutscenes in all of video games, as you might expect from Kojima. The characters are using metahuman tech here, and I think they look much more real than their counterparts in other Decima Engine games and the Horizon games, or even in the characters from the first game. The facial scans look really, really accurate. The likeness of each actor is just perfect in a way oftentimes you see in games. There's like a little bit of inconsistency between the way the actor looks and the way their skin looks and their hair looks and their portrayal in the game, but here it just looks perfect throughout. The lip sync is very good. The characters emote quite convincingly here. And there's obviously that scene at the end as well with the two characters kissing with Norman Reedus and Leia Seydoux. I think those are the names. Kissing, not their names. The game.
The names of the game are.
And you get that nose bending thing, and that reminded me a lot of that same sequence with Nate and Alina in Uncharted 4 that was so famous. So it's that nice little detail here that they're throwing in there as like a kind of a flex almost. That looks pretty good. In general, in terms of the technology, there were some things that I'm kind of wondering about. Maybe Alex can provide his own insight here, but I was thinking about the lighting here, and I'm not really sure about RTGI. Like, there are some large-scale environments with pretty good indirect diffuse lighting, and in earlier trailers, there were some moments where you'd like open a hatch and light would spill in quite beautifully into the scene, which seemed quite RTGI-ish, or potentially these moments of large-scale destruction. But in any case, whatever they're doing here looks hugely improved over the first game. It didn't have that like rich, physically accurate look as much as we're seeing here. I think in a lot of scenarios, that first game looked a little bit more stark. Didn't look as nice as this does in that respect. Yeah. In other areas, it's a little bit less, there are less questions about it. Like, I'm pretty sure we're seeing signs of shadow maps, pretty clear shadow aliasing and cutscenes, things like that. And then it's pretty obviously relying on SSR for like that specular response in water surfaces. You see big occlusion issues. They're kind of careful to not position the camera in a way that would reveal occlusion issues too much, but at the edge of the screen, you see that kind of characteristic SSR occlusion problem where it's kind of not appearing there. But the kind of weird aspect of it for me, and an aspect that I'm kind of throwing my hands up and asking some questions about potentially, is image quality. Now, image quality is pretty good in this trailer. There are some issues with like common pain points like the intersection of hair and depth of field, stuff like that. Not a big deal at all. But I did get a couple of pixel counts, and they came in close to 4K or at 4K, maybe slightly under sometimes, but others quite close to a 4K match. Those shots are all in gameplay at 30 FPS, and again, the specific platform used to capture gameplay was not delineated specifically. But certainly I'm thinking like if it was using RTGI on base PS5, maybe those numbers would be lower, right, is my thinking, because that's not typical. We'd see a game running at or near 4K with a prominent ray traced lighting effect on PS5. So that's kind of just throwing a couple questions in there because we don't know the specifics of what it's captured on, or if they're using the technique in the first place or whatever. There's some signs of it here and there, but who knows? So yeah, I'm not too sure about that or where it quite points you, but I think one thing you can be pretty confident about is, regardless of any techniques that may or may not be are being used there, I think the game just looks tremendous. I think it's going to be one of the best looking current generation games out when it arrives, I think on June 25th. So it's coming out pretty soon here.
Getting to your point at hand, in terms of RTGI, it's really hard to point it at this trailer because so much of it is dedicated to cutscenes. And in cutscenes, you have extreme leeway to just point lights, turn on lights, use soft lights that don't have a specular component. You know, there's a lot of things you can do in rasterization in a directed camera scenario, like you were just describing with the SSR, where they really try and avoid it. Like the camera is always like here, the water plane's here, and the camera's always here. It's a perfect place for it to be. So they're doing a lot there. And so since this trailer is made up so, like, if I didn't want spoilers, I would not watch this, by the way. It's got so much in it. But yeah, so like, I don't want to actually say yes or no on that because so much of it is based upon the trailers and also the landscapes of a game like Death Stranding. The best place is that raster GI works really, really well. Even Probe Solutions is rolling, undulating hills and such. And the first game was made up of a lot of that. It wasn't nearly as well indirectly lit as I would say this was. But we also saw improvements in indirect lighting between Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West, you know? So I think it is possible, even with a raster GI solution, given the landscapes in this game, to have a much more convincing indirect lighting scenario without having to rely on ray tracing. It just really depends, you know. But the resolution and the frame rate presentation, I think, is interesting. The first game, obviously on PS4 and PS4 Pro, 30 FPS title. And I would be curious to see, since we're seeing this like this, I'd be curious to see if this is actually a 30 FPS title. It is very, very good looking in terms of like all the stuff that they're showing here. We already saw, especially since it's presented at native 4K, like your pixel counts show. We don't know the actual platform. PS5 could be an umbrella term. But that would be an interesting thing. It would allow them to push certain things much harder, especially in terms of the way cutscenes are directed. If you're not trying to achieve a steady 60 FPS in cutscenes, you can go crazy with things like how close the depth of field is, how expensive the depth of field is, things like the hair, which is a really big part of this. You know, having multiple characters in a scene with complex hair is expensive at 60 FPS, but much more doable at 30. You know, I'm actually very interested to see what ends up coming out of this. If it looks like this on a base PS5, I would be astounded on a lot of levels at 60 FPS. But at 30 FPS, I think it all seems a lot more realistic. And in which case, I'd be curious about like resolution, DRS, anything like that. And in the eventuality, since this is my personal interest, first game was published separately, away from Sony on the PC platform and then kind of brought back later with the director's cut. I would be really curious to see what they've been doing with Decima that maybe goes beyond what they've shown in this trailer. The first game didn't scale that much higher on PC. Maybe this could, historically at least, when Kojima was working with Fox Engine. One of the things that I really loved about MGS5 is that they had the high setting that they used on consoles primarily, but then they had this very high setting which pushed out like depth of field in a really cool way, pushed SSR out in a really good way, shadows and stuff. I would like to see that more because like the first game, like on PC, it still had tons of pop-in on it, you know, while it was running at like hundreds of FPS on like processors from back then. So I would love to see if they could push those things out further in the eventuality of a PC release. But yeah, cool trailer. Still have no idea what the hell's going on. I guess that's fine for those who are into this kind of thing. So yeah.
Everybody seems very excited about some kind of pseudo Metal Gear Solid association.
Like, the thing looks like Metal Gear, and the dude looks like Snake. Yeah. That's basically it.
Wow.
The
scalability thing is an interesting question, Alex, because Sony now, and Gorilla, Decima, does actually have a reason to scale. That reason being PS5 Pro. So you would hope that there would be some sort of scalability built in just to service the PlayStation 5 family. Similarly, if there are going to be experiments happening, or if indeed Sony is indeed planning its own handheld, they would be looking to have some kind of thought towards that in the future. So yeah, maybe there will be some sort of scalability to it for PC. I'd hope so. Yeah, not really too much more to say about this. Oliver, you're saying that basically it's native 4K on the areas you could discern, right?
It's native 4K or very close during the gameplay sections, like lots of fighting and explosions, things like that you can count.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, 30 FPS on Pro would solve a lot of those sort of viability questions, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'd hope that they could run it at a higher frame rate on PlayStation 5 and definitely PlayStation 5 Pro consoles. Maybe use that in-house Gorilla, really impressive upsampling there. Hopefully for this title, but I don't know that it's present here. I wasn't like, it didn't look super like that to me here. It looked a little bit sharper and maybe a little bit noisier than that, but that's very preliminary given that we're looking at just compressed YouTube footage, but I wasn't getting quite that impression, but perhaps they will in the final title adopt that. Who knows?
All of the Sony first party games have had some sort of 60 FPS support, I believe.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's probably going to happen for this one. You'd think, but 30 FPS would be fine as well for presentational purposes, and certainly looks fantastic. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so this week we couldn't get a video review ready in time, but the Ryzen 9 9950 X3D has arrived, the latest and greatest CPU from AMD, and I have personal stakes in this because I've bought one, and here it is. Yep, it's time to upgrade my PC.
That's awesome.
It's time to upgrade my PC from the 13900K, which it's always been a bit questionable, that PC. It used to crash a lot, which I thought was the issue with the high voltage. The BIOS updates seem to improve matters, though. It's been relatively stable. However, we're seeing big performance increases, and the thing about this Ryzen processor is that it's the best of both worlds, the best of all worlds. You want a high productivity based processor for the kind of work we do, but at the same time, you want the X3D cache for the gaming side of things. And with the previous X3D, there's always been some sort of gotcha, right, when it comes to the 16-core parts. But Will's reviewed it. He's put all the benchmarks together. I've put some notes together based on his benchmarks, and holy crap, I'm glad I bought this thing. It looks like a complete beast. I just first of all wanted to talk quickly about video encoding. It seems to be marginally faster than the 9950X non-3D, which is great.
That's
blows
cool.
my 13900K out of the water, which is great because video encoding is one of the most CPU intensive tasks we do. But the gaming side of things, the 9800X3D was kind of mind-blowing. And so it is with this. I'm just going to go through some of the games based on Will's benchmarks here. Dragon's Dogma 2, we've got this custom run where we just sort of circle around the city. And it is very CPU intensive. 32% faster than the non-X3D product.
Wow.
which is nuts. This puts it on par with the 9800X3D, 15% faster than a 14900K. There are a couple of scenarios where this thing is slightly slower than the 9800X3D. Starfield, the 9800X3D, 4% faster, but come on, 4%. I can trade that 4% for 8 more cores and 16 more threads for my production work. And even so, they're 20% faster than the 9950X, 8% faster than the 14900K. Mind-blowing. We've got our custom run also here in Cyberpunk 2077, where we just circle the Cherry Blossom Marketplace, and this batters the CPU. This is another example where the X3D, the 8-core one, 3% faster, so I don't care, 19% faster than the non-3D model, 15% faster than the 14900K. I mean, holy crap, this is just astonishing. Alex, we have to do this one, Flight Simulator 2020. That run over New York, which is basically super CPU limited, 35% faster than the non-X3D model. 35%. That puts it on par with the 9800X3D, 32% faster than the 14900K. There are certain games where just having the 3D cache just gives like a monumental boost to performance, and I think we can quite safely say it's the ones that aren't particularly cache friendly, aren't particularly optimal from a CPU perspective. And I also was quite interested in Will's result for Far Cry 5 because that engine really is still driven mostly by a single core, but it does seem to be the case that, again, the X3D makes a big difference. Another 35% win over the non-X3D model.
That's
the
great.
9800 X3D, the 8-core part, 3.5% faster, but again, that's irrelevant. The 14900K comparison, wow, 37.5% faster than a 14900K, which in turn means it's going to be like wiping the floor with the Arrow Lake parts. Yeah. Final one, which kind of blew my mind a bit, almost to the point where it's, well, the first rule of benchmarking is if something looks wrong, you kind of think it is wrong. So maybe I'd like to retest this, but it actually, thinking about it, sort of makes sense. Baldur's Gate 3, Act 3, Alex. We got that custom run through the city of Baldur's Gate, 48% faster than the non-X3D model.
That jives.
The reason why I actually think the benchmark is sound is because it is on par with the 9800 X3D, 43% faster than the 14900K. So Oliver, sitting there with your 14700K, isn't it?
13700K.
30.
Not even as good as that.
Yeah, you've been thinking about upgrading for a while.
Yes,
does this
I
hit
have.
The spot for you?
Well, I've been contemplating upgrading different computers at different points this year, but I'm trying to restrain myself to some degree.
Yeah.
But this seems this seems really compelling. It's within a margin of error with the 9800 X3D, which is obviously the fastest gaming processor by some margin, and it basically seems to me really on par with the 9950X, which was already pretty much the fastest content creation processor in the business for almost anything. So, and they also seem to have sorted out all the CPU scheduling that they had, issues that they had with gaming tasks not consistently running on the Vcache CCD. That seems sorted out as well. And they also say you don't need to reinstall Windows between processor swaps necessarily, which is a nice boost for ease of use, and I'm sure for testing and benchmarking as well. So it seems like a really strong product. Best of all worlds, almost any production relevant workload. It's the fastest CPU available for Windows users. So that's pretty promising. I would be very curious to see a comparison between this and something like the Apple M3 Ultra, which I think is probably faster in a lot of circumstances. That would be interesting. Although I don't know if you consider that consumer level necessarily, because Apple doesn't really have a super delineated pro and consumer line necessarily. But that CPU is obviously very expensive. So yeah, I think this is a really promising CPU. It's certainly something I consider if I was going to get a gaming computer upgrade. But I think now I would probably gravitate towards the 9800 X3D, just because if you're doing testing on it, you know 100% that it's going to operate within the parameters you probably think it will. There's no dual CCD stuff. So I would just like to eliminate that one source of like testing uncertainty. I know in the BIOS you can disable the second CCD if you want to, but that seems like
but nobody's ever going to do that realistically.
No. If it was just for casual use, then I think the 9800 X3D or the 9950 X3D rather is a really compelling CPU. But if you're doing like testing on it, I think 9800 X3D is just a bit more reliable in that respect.
Alex, thoughts?
I'm just listening for the crickets coming from Intel here, and they don't got anything, man. They got nothing. It's crazy. The AMD dominance is glorious. I really love the X3D chips. Like Rich, I switched from a 12900K, and for me there were aspects of the 12900K in that system that I really liked, but for me actually the E-cores were always the biggest problem, kind of like the 7950 X3D parts, etc., where you wouldn't, with the gremlins in the system, you weren't sure if you were getting the proper performance you should be getting due to the fact that scheduling was maybe not prioritizing the right cores. And that really pushed me away from that system. There were so many times where I would go in a game and I'd just be like, I'm losing performance by having E-cores on. I'm losing performance by having E-cores on. And that is, if they've really cleaned this up based on Will's benches, like that they show off, this minor 3 to 4% lower than 900X3D is, like you said, completely irrelevant. No one cares. And if they really did clean that up, then this is a great multi-purpose processor, because you're getting that extra width when you really need it for the tasks that we do. I'd be very curious to see how it scales also in like crazy recording casts, like 8K 60 with like super high quality. Like we have the ability to do that, or even, like 4K 120.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. We'll get onto the platform in a second, Alex.
Yeah, and and I'm very curious about all those things. Also, the boards that you attach with it, I'm always really curious about, like how many PCIe lanes this thing would have, because I extensively use all of them. So, that's all these kind of things, and I think this sounds like an amazing product. What is the retail MSRP?
Well, curious. This is where we start going into, into Here Be Dragons territory. Okay. Because I understood that this thing in the UK costs £659, right?
That'd be good.
Which is like 200 more than the 9800X3D, which I think is actually a good price. I ended up paying £700 from a highly reputable supplier in the UK, simply because all of the other suppliers in the UK were charging £700 for it. So yes, I was scalped by a retailer, and that's unacceptable. And, again, what's going on in the PC hardware market? It's kind of like, I guess you could call it capitalism, and the laws of supply and demand. But, it doesn't seem to happen with other areas of consumer electronics, right? In terms of anything that isn't a PC part specifically. If I want to buy a Samsung S25 Ultra, I go to the Samsung website, I see the MSRP there, and I buy one. If I want a new Mac, same difference, right? If I want a PlayStation, it's very rare that I go to Amazon and see Amazon trying to rip me off. What's going on here? This has got to be sorted out. It's completely nuts. Let's talk about the platform, Alex, because yes, I do want to actually work with this thing. That's the key point of it. It's a personal PC, but I am going to be using it for my workstation. And there's a problem with PCIe lanes that hasn't been solved since the end of the high-end desktop line. And I've got an Asus X670E Pro Art creator board.
That's a good one.
Which it's got basically the lanes can be quite intelligently divided. So you have two 8X lanes if you want them across two slots, and then a 4X lane that comes off the chipset. So in theory, then, I can have my GPU on one of the X8 slots, and I can have the 8K capture card on the next X8 slot. It needs an X8 slot. And then we can have a 4K card on the X4 slot. So that should work. I think that's how you've got things set up on your system, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's an older board. It's PCIe 4, and then also the bottom can be 4, but also that limits, I don't know what it is like on yours, but that limits how many NVMEs I can throw in the system.
Yeah, I think I can have a maximum of 4.
Okay, see, I have a maximum of 2 with the setup on mine.
That's unacceptable.
That is unacceptable. But as a result, they're very high capacity ones, and then the rest is going through SATA on my end for like longer cold storage kind of stuff, but not really cold. It's warm. But yeah, I that's what I'm always curious about. Yeah, it's tepid. It's an SSD SATA. They don't get that hot anymore. But that's the always thing for my buying preferences for these things, which is really to look for it. Because like lately, also I updated the BIOS on my board, and I've been struggling with PCIe since then a little bit occasionally. Some gremlins that I'm trying to chase, and if I just had enough from the get-go, I wouldn't be chasing these things anyway. So that would be my upgrade direction to ensure, because I use Rich. I use a 4090 as the GPU. Then depends on the capture card it depends for the like 4K 60 or 4K 121. Depends on what I'm capturing, because I'll use the one that has more flexibility with HDR, for example, as well as it works better with my PlayStation 5 Pro. And then on the bottom of that, I have an analog capture card, which is 4X. And it definitely uses that when I'm doing something like 1080p. And I want to use RGB with that, actually, because low resolution content, you can't really be decimating the chroma on it because it looks really, really bad. So
when you do your zooms and stuff, especially.
Yeah, so you really don't want to do that. Depending upon also what I'm recording, I want more than 422 or 420. I want 444 occasionally, and these are things that I need all the PCIe for, and that's not a guarantee. And your platform sounds great, though.
Well, fingers crossed it all works.
Yeah.
That's all I can really say. I'm just kind of baffled. On my main test system for GPU reviewing, it uses a 9800X3D. High-end Asus board, it's got 2 PCIe slots. I mean, if I'm buying a high-end Asus board, I'd kind of like more than 2 PCIe slots. It's kind of a bit bizarre, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there we are. Okay.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts there, Alex?
You're going to have to, that
Report
first
back.
memory training you're going to have when you
fun,
turn on the board. Yeah, it is a little scary because you're not sure what's going on. So get used to that. And also get used to, since this is your first, I think it's the first time you'd be using a Ryzen platform for your main editing rig, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The memory training, as well as setting up whether or not to use memory context restore. I've had less luck with it than other people. I would say
what is
it
it,
off.
first of all?
Okay, so memory context restore remembers essentially the settings that the memory training does from the previous boots. So it doesn't have to do it to the same degree. But the problem is I've had boot errors when that thing starts. It doesn't get to post ever if I use it.
That's problematic.
That is problematic, but maybe you're luckier than me.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll keep everyone posted there. GPU-wise, I currently use a 4080, which I'm quite happy with. The main reason I use the 4080 is that there's, it wasn't useful for anything else. It was that weird kind of in-betweener GPU. Obviously, for most of our sort of high-end testing, we use the 4090. I guess I could use a 4090 now, the 5090s here, but yeah, I'll keep you posted. Anyway, that's going to be fun to build. But until then, let's move on. Interesting news story this week. It's been rumored for some time that Oblivion is actually going to receive a remake, a remaster perhaps, and it's going to be running on Unreal Engine 5. Lots to talk about on this one, Alex.
Yes.
I'm going to venture to suggest it's going to be one of these things similar to the way Bluepoint handles remasters, or the way I think the new Metal Gear Delta works, where Unreal Engine is essentially a wrapper around the original engine. Possibly that would make sense. I just can't imagine Unreal Engine 5 being able to do things that the original Bethesda engine does.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. All the things, they would have to essentially reprogram everything into Unreal Engine 5. And it seems like an absolute waste of time when the gameplay code is already there. And you could, almost like RTX Remix, essentially replace the rendering. That is much more doable. I'd be very curious, though, what that CPU workload looks like. I would be very curious to see what that looks like. But I think this is a really cool idea because there's a really great opportunity here to fix aspects of Oblivion along with giving people access to a game that, a lot of people are younger and maybe didn't play it on Xbox 360 or PS3 or PC back in the day. And this is a really great opportunity to play it again and maybe go back in and tweak some things. On the visual side, I think what they need to do is ensure that it's very bloomy and strange looking, just like the original.
Is that a technical term?
That is a very technical term, bloomy and strange. I think there's a white paper on that one. And they also, water needs to look great. It needs to be wonderfully green. It's got to have those teals. There's a certain look that I think they abandoned after that when they moved to Skyrim, where it was much more earthen toned, and Oblivion almost looks like a fantasy novel cover that you'd pick up at like a $1 store. It's very, very, very particular look that I hope they maintain. On the gameplay side, I would be really excited to see them get rid of auto leveling of the world alongside you. I always thought that took out the entire RPG element of the RPG. It was like you would get better, but then your enemies would get better. So the sense of progression was limited to abilities, which just kind of scaled in a way that wasn't ever satisfying. People like to farm in RPGs. You couldn't really farm in Oblivion other than getting a bunch of stuff. It's also an opportunity to revisit some of the dungeons. There's a lot that can be done here, but there's only so much that can be done at the same time if they do end up using the gameplay code from back then. I'd be curious to see if the game actually does run above 60 FPS without causing big issues. The original game has big issues above 60 FPS. I'd be curious to see also if they would keep in the janky animations from the original game, or if that would be a different thing entirely. I don't know what is technically possible. This would be one of the first times we've seen something scaled from this generation of hardware in this manner. So there's a whole lot of open questions I've had, but apparently it's also like imminent, like it might be shadow dropped.
This is the report that's apparently from noted leaker Nate the Hate. I say leaker. Basically, he's report. This is the thing that kind of I find quite frustrating. It's totally irrelevant, but he's not the leaker. He's reporting a leak that's happened. He didn't leak it. He doesn't work for Bethesda or whoever. But yeah, anyway, there is an interesting leak here saying that that yes, there'll be some marketing soon, and then the game will be available very, very soon after. Which I'm quite, I'm on board with. There's also discussion on what's going to be changing. 6 reworked systems, according to this Video Games Chronicle report, which includes stamina, sneaking, blocking, archery, hit reaction, and HUD. Improvements to the game's blocking system have reportedly been inspired by Souls-like games, while sneak icons are now highlighted in the new system, according to MP1ST. So it does look as though they are going to be making some gameplay changes at least. Mm-hmm. It seems to be that Virtuos is working on it, which they've got a bit of a spotty track record. Just thinking back to that 45 FPS cap on Arkham Asylum.
Not my choice necessarily. All right.
Any thoughts on this one, Oliver?
This project has been rumored for so long now. I think it initially leaked out in the Acta Blizzard court documents with the Microsoft acquisition way back when, that previewed the original design for the next generation Xbox, among other things. But here it sounds like the graphics are going to be probably fully remade in UE5. I have seen some fan efforts that have taken the original models and environment and things like that from Oblivion into Unreal Engine 5, and it actually looks pretty all right there with the improved lighting and things like that. But I'd presume here it will be a more substantial effort given the time and amount of money they've presumably poured into this. But I think it would probably still have some of the same limitations as the original, just in terms of the way the game is structured. I'd presume the game is still going to be segmented in the same way for gameplay purposes, like having the cities as separate areas, having individual inns, shops, things like this, buildings, caves, things like that in separate areas. I'd hope, though, that there are some gameplay systems they could touch up. Like Alex said, that level scaling was kind of awkward. And that was actually a problem in Oblivion. It wasn't just an issue in terms of player progression. It was also an issue in terms of having NPCs die very easily, because the NPCs wouldn't scale and level in the same way that the enemies did. So if you were trying to complete some of the end game missions, but you were already a very high level, like you completed a lot of the side content, your companions would just get one-shotted by these demons. It was quite bad. So yeah, my own personal experience with Oblivion, I got it on day one on both 360 and PC. I was super excited for that. Although I remember playing it on PC and actually being more excited with the visuals even though I had a weaker PC than on my Xbox, just because I think blown up to a 40-inch TV, the game did not look quite as appealing to me as it did on my PC. I also probably had better anisotropic filtering settings
that game
on
doesn't
PC
have
at
any.
that time. There's still some elements of it that look like visually pretty awkward, even though at the time it looked pretty good, like the billboarded trees, the pretty limited use of shadow maps, and yeah, that bloom effect, I'm not so keen on that. Maybe
I love it.
Keen on that. I'm not a huge fan of that. And also, like, there are some weird quirks that I don't know if they're going to overcome these or address them in some way, but like the creation engine terrain system was pretty limited as far as I recall. Like, you had these rolling hills and nothing more kind of angular or overhanging than that in terms of the terrain. That was also an issue in Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, and I think it was overcome to some degree by the time Skyrim came out. It looked a lot better in that respect, at least. There's also issues with the VO, like famously the male VO was mostly done by one voice actor for the non-named NPCs, or not the non-named NPCs, but just the less prominent NPCs. You had like Board Patrick Stewart in there, but you didn't have a whole lot of variance between like the male orcs and the male humans of different kinds and things like this. That was not so good. But yeah, there are a number of areas they could touch on, but also there's a certain charm to Oblivion and a certain charm to how like broken the Radiant AI could be, and certain charm to the voices, and charm to Board Patrick Stewart, and charm to like the way the faces look so awkward. I don't know what elements necessarily that you want to improve in a really wholesale way to get it up to that modern experience, or if you want to kind of leave it in the middle a little bit and have some of that kind of rustic elements still in the mix potentially for players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Star Trek the animated series, Alex, where basically Scotty and Nurse Chapel did all the other voices.
It's the exact same, yeah. They all sound like variations on the same human. It's incredible.
Okay, well, it sounds as though we should be finding out about this sooner rather than later, if these rumors are to believe. So, I guess we'll be on top of that if and when it emerges. With that, let's move on. So our final news topic of the week, and this was a report that was sourced by Tom Warren at The Verge, where a video emerged of Sony's experimentations with AI conversations with characters in games. We've seen it all before with Nvidia's Ace character interaction. And Alex, I don't know if you saw that video, but it was basically exactly the same, right, as Ace?
Well, a lot less polished, I would definitely say, in terms of facial animation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Aloy had some very interesting tics going on there, which didn't quite match her character.
No, didn't. I think this is both a good and a very bad thing at the same time. It's good in the aspect that you can imagine in a game that you could have more dynamic, branching conversational options with non-quest, like non-main quest NPCs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Presuming the actors sign off, or maybe they're just fully generated voices, or the big problem I have with this is that they use Aloy here, and there's a very specific person who voices Aloy, and their creative artistic work, they're licensing their voice for the product, and there's, just like in the movie industry, there has to be a way to have your image, your voice, your likeness be almost your own thing that you're selling, and you get then money after the fact when they do reruns of a show or they re-release a show. And that's something that needs to be kind of thought out in the system if we're going to be using AI generated likenesses and voices for games. And that's the one area that think is really morally gray and not good. But in terms of what it could mean from a gameplay perspective, it could be enriching to an experience if it is done well and not awkward, and there isn't tons of delay, and all these other things like we saw with cloud gaming, where you can imagine experience, but it's a matter of getting there with all these steps in terms of latency and believability. So
you're imagining a scenario there that is completely at odds with the video that we saw.
It is complete. Yeah, I was being very generous. It did not look good at all. Yeah, and also like this is not the character I would have used for it. It's really bizarre that they chose Aloy. there are tons of other like side characters in games that would probably be way better fit. I don't know.
Right.
What do you think?
I'm very interested in Oliver's take on this, bearing in mind he is our resident master of AI.
Yeah.
I'm very split on this. I'm kind of split on this because I think one issue just comes down to the actual quality of the demo. It's kind of low quality and a little bit bizarre. It doesn't make sense fundamentally within the context of the games or anything related to the games that Aloy would just be sitting there addressing the player or some stranger in the game with basically a Wikipedia synopsis of the game's plot. And also in the context of a game, the player character would never ask the question, I have some questions about Horizon. Like the players in the game do not think of their world as Horizon. It's a marketing term for the game. You know, I mean, that's so bizarre to me. Also, the dialogue is not written by like Aloy dialogue would be. The quality of the voice synthesis is very low. It doesn't sound like the actor at all, Ashley Birch, either. Obviously, there are some issues, obviously, that Alex has talked about with using a voice clone of the actor without some kind of arrangement potentially, but it doesn't sound like her, and that's very off-putting because this is a distinctive character, but it's a very generic voice. The automated lip sync is actually pretty good here, but the rest of the facial animation is otherwise very static and a little bit awkward. Like the eyes are not always looking in the direction of the player. It looks a little strange there. The tech stack they're using, which apparently is GPT-4, Whisper, and Llama 3 in some capacity, plus something I'm sure to drive the animations, is not working at the level that it really needs to. And I think we have such high expectations for the characterization of game characters. Like if you look at what we as humans see as high quality, plausible representations of characters in games, we're looking at titles like Uncharted 4 or Hellblade 2. These titles that look really, really incredible, have a lot of very careful hand-done work, are these carefully curated cinematic experiences, totally like this. And even relative to some like of the Nvidia Ace demos we've seen and stuff like that, including at CES 2025, this is not particularly close to that. Like, and also the Nvidia demos aren't necessarily there in terms of quality either.
Right.
But on the other hand, and this is where I'd be more positive about it potentially, is that, you know, I think there is a role for technology like this in games, especially games that are built around this tech where you can maybe see past some of the limitations that are kind of inherent to the tech at the moment. I think about the game Facade, which is a game I'm thinking a lot about recently, which is a game from 20 years ago where basically you could type in your responses to characters at a dinner party who are having some kind of marital dispute. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, and it had this kind of hand-coded AI system that could kind of do a rough kind of sentiment analysis on what you were saying, or respond to keywords. It was very, very crude. But I imagine a game like that nowadays, using a system like this, could actually be very compelling and maybe could give you a much more dynamic gameplay experience. So I'd really try to think about the kinds of games and applications that would enable experiences above and beyond where games are now in terms of that dynamism, in terms of responding directly to like intimate and intricate player feedback. That's the kind of thing that seems really cool to me. But as like a replacement for a voice actor in a scripted narrative game, I don't think it'll get to that level anytime soon. State-of-the-art voice synthesis isn't not very good in my opinion. And, you know, I think for dynamic reactions or dynamic dialogue, it could have a role. But I think you always want to have good acting and crystal clear sound quality and good sound quality. That matters so much in the game. So I wouldn't worry about that side of it too much. Maybe in some games people will try it for that purpose, but I'd hope not too much there. I just think this is the kind of thing that could enable an experience that probably we can't even contemplate in the current moment. Like I really think it could enable something that's really quite exciting, but not in the context of like a super narrative-oriented game. I think those will always exist, and I don't think it has much of a place there, but I'm not sure that this demo is like super intricate, super carefully put together. I think it's just something they were showing off behind closed doors. It's kind of a crude little sample, but I don't think this indicates any kind of like ideation on an actual game product. I wouldn't think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Lots of thoughts about this. Where do I begin? I've played these Ace demos that Nvidia has done, right? And ultimately you're being asked to be sort of like a highly, you know, it's your agency being injected into the story. The problem is, whenever I've had these demos, you know, you kind of go to the demo and it's like, well, where do you begin? What should I say? You know, what's going on? It's actually quite difficult to get to grips with it, and you have to be deeply immersed in the lore, in the concept, in order. You almost have to be a role player as such, an actual role player. And it just causes friction, right? You're just standing there wondering what to say for the most part. And then basically whoever's guiding you through the demo does exactly that. They say, well, okay, maybe you should ask them about this. Maybe you should ask them about that. If you just have, a dialogue tree similar to what you have now, you just get through it a lot quicker. You get reminded of your place in the story and how it should be progressing. Giving too much agency to the player actually makes things somewhat worse. Also, the quality of the interaction. There's always this sort of lag between asking a question or saying something and getting a reply. It's just completely immersion breaking because it doesn't happen in real life, and that's essentially what they're trying to do here, to make conversations closer to real life. But the immersion aspect of it's just kind of broken. And I've been thinking a lot about what this reminds me of, and I sort of I said it to you the other day, Alex.
Yes.
It's like the old prank phone calls with the Arnold Schwarzenegger soundboard, where you're desperately trying to come up with phrases that fit the circumstances to sort of make things happen. And that's complete with the lag as well, the all important lag.
The awkward pause when they have to search for the
for the correct Arnie sound quote. That's exactly what it reminded me of. So I don't really see how this is going to have any sort of long-term impact on narrative-driven games. But we've got some interesting supporter questions on it, that's for sure. This one from Hunter. Would you be open to having Aloy as a guest on the podcast? I realise she may not be particularly well versed in current technology, but maybe if she shoves her stick into a 5070 Ti and points her focus at it, she'll have something relevant to say.
Oh boy.
This question, while interacting with chatbots, that's exactly it, a chatbot. While interacting with chatbots like Aloy is neat, I'd rather see AI take things a step further, bringing NPCs and the world to life in more dynamic, immersive ways, instead of just reducing them to basic chatbots. Imagine taking full damage or breaking a fence with your sword and an NPC reacts dynamically. Took quite a fall there, or what did that fence ever do to you? An AI-driven system could generate endless natural interactions, creating immersion that studios couldn't afford to fully voice act. Wouldn't this be a more compelling use of AI than just another chatbot? What are your thoughts?
That's an interesting one.
That is. I just think AI is going to be used much more generally for more, to make NPCs and like crowd behaviors a lot more realistic. And more context driven, because I think that's probably one of the big weaknesses of NPCs in a lot of the open world games. For example, you can do some crazy stuff and they don't give a toss. There's only very limited interactions or reactions rather to your inputs, and it's always a bit immersion breaking. But if you actually have more natural behaviors generated by AI, doesn't need to be sort of deep. You don't need to be holding like deep dive conversations with Aloy. It just needs to be, more realistic reactions in the game world to your inputs. I think that would be far more transformative. Any final thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, this demo is just a bad venue for showing off the best of AI. I'm sure they really just had this behind closed doors, never intended certainly for it to reach the public. Indeed, they pulled the videos using a copyright claim pretty quickly there, so I don't think they intended this as a finished product at all. You really need NPCs to be much more context aware, and a character just monologuing to the camera is pretty boring. Indeed, reading off of Wikipedia to the camera, again, a pretty boring experience. But I think there is probably room for interesting experiences, maybe indie games that are built around this tech, potentially like a Facade style game like I mentioned. That could be fun, but in the interim, most of these applications are not that interesting when they're just bolted onto existing game concepts or given very simple monologues. It needs to be something a little bit more interesting than that, I feel.
I'll tell you what, Alex, how about this? An AI-driven Arnold Schwarzenegger soundboard.
I would kill for it.
Yeah. Okay. And with that, let's move on. Okay, let's move on to supporter Q&A. Every week I post on our Patreon asking our supporters to, basically pose their questions. and respond to our news topics. And yes, I choose the best, or rather the ones we're best equipped to answer. Going to start off with a couple of questions which, we're going to sort of group them together. Basically, there was quite a big reaction to our story last week, where essentially Mark Cerny answered a bunch of questions we had about Project Amethyst and the relationship between PSSR and FSR4. The upshot being that next year we should expect to see a variation, a re-implementation of FSR4 for PlayStation 5 Pro, and that will be the next evolution of PSSR. Lots of people basically saying, well, PSSR's dead. FSR4 is taking over. It's a disaster for Sony. Quite baffling reactions, I have to say. Let's talk about these questions, though. Bespoke exclamation point asks, crazy how even supposedly respectable journalists, like a not-to-be-named The Verge reporter, tried twisting what Mark Cerny said about PSSR into quote-unquote, it failed, so now we are switching to FSR4. The way I see it, FSR3 equals DLSS1, PSSR equals DLSS2, FSR4 better than DLSS3, PSSR2 equals DLSS3. I'm not sure that's my take.
Hierarchy is interesting.
It's certainly an interesting take. I think that by the time we get DLSS5, FSR5, 6, PSSR3, 4, the super resolution part of these upscalers will be indistinguishable from native. No real question. Don't know why I bothered then. Just making an observation. But can we give a heck yes for Oliver seemingly moving above ground? You're always above ground, Oliver. I don't think that's.
I'd like to think so.
You just record it. You just record at nights, don't you? That's the bottom line.
I do. It's what, 2 a.m. here? It's 3 a.m. here. Quite late.
Oh my God.
Anyway, we got this question, and it is actually a question from Dajarko in brackets Dan. Happy half fortnight, gents! Exclamation point. I've been reading Cerny's comments closely and comparing them to the stated figures for the RDNA 4 GPUs. It seems that in order to compare RDNA 4 GPUs correctly with the Pro, we must determine that the quote-unquote dense tops for Int 8 are. What the dense tops are, rather. According to the 9000 series wiki page and a few other sources, 9070 has 289 Int 8 dense tops, and the 9070 XT has 389 Int 8 dense tops. It would seem that all the AMD marketing for the new GPUs uses the comically inflated Int 4 sparse figures, with Cerny also stating that sparsity is not especially important for the kind of models that they are using for PSSR. It would seem as though the PS5 Pro sits between the new AMD mid-range cards in terms of dense Int 8 tops performance. This is getting dense, isn't it? It also seems conceivable that FSR4 would need to be performant on the rumoured lower stack cards, i.e. the 9050/9060. In light of all of this, have we underestimated PS5 Pro, or have Sony pissed on their chips? Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, we've got this question of timelines about the relationship between Sony and AMD and PSSR and FSR4. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex.
What?
PSSR has been in development with Sony for like years, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And FSR4 was remarkably, some might say, seemingly done in around 9 months, or certainly in a much shorter time period than PSSR.
Right.
So the narrative seems to be, from the Mark Cerny side, is that FSR4 is essentially a collaboration, bringing everybody's work together. Is that right? So one might say that PSSR research over those years probably had an accelerating impact on FSR4 development, because it does seem quite unlikely that AMD would just produce this remarkably good upscaler so quickly and out of nowhere.
Well, yes. I imagine there is a back and forth, but obviously AMD's been hiring a lot of people in the interim time to beef up their machine learning capacity, just like they hired a lot of people to beef up the ray tracing capacity of their business. Like in between, after RDNA 3 came out, it was like right around then. And you could just follow the LinkedIn and get a sense of that. And you could also see that on the ML front as well, too. So I think it's like that kind of combination of things. But I think the timeline is the most important part. The like you said, they had a console that needed to come out at a certain time to be a bridging gap in terms of time between PS5 and PS6, just like the PS4 Pro was. And they needed to have something ready, even if AMD didn't have anything ready for them. So I think they rolled a lot of PSSR on their own initially. And then maybe some of that fed back into FSR4 development. The only one thing in regards to the second question that I will just like contest in general is we already know from at least Nvidia side of things that they are, for that transformer model, they are no longer using integer math for that. It is floating point. I think it's relied on their new FP8 performance, primarily unlocked with Ada Lovelace and Blackwell GPUs. So they scale really well with the transformer model. Whereas when you go down to the lower models, especially for the biggest ones like ray reconstruction, which is huge, it performs a lot worse on those GPUs. This is the one thing that we don't really know about with PS5 Pro and RDNA 4 is like, one, sparsity may not have anything to do with it, but in just general, the question for me is like, does PS5 Pro even support sparsity? Who knows? Older Nvidia GPUs didn't, right? Another thing is like, is FSR 4 reliant on this integer 8 maths to do the work that it needs to do? And we don't know that either. So it's a lot of guessing. I don't really know, but the porting period to me seems really long for something, that arguably, if it was in between RDNA, if its performance that was the most important part is in between the levels of RDNA there, the 9070 and the 9070 XT, well, then it seems like it would be a simple porting process, but it's longer. And I think it may have to do with the specific maths that they use for it, the way it's scaled, or the fact that we're talking about an RDNA 2, RDNA 4, and 3 hybrid GPU with a completely different cache structure and everything, and maybe it needs a lot more finessing to get in that than an RDNA 4 GPU, even one that has less theoretical ML performance, because maybe actually that is the limiting aspect of performance, something that Oliver also talked to with Mark Cerny in his interview back then. So I don't know. I just think the porting period after the fact that they say in the beginning of 2025, which is where we now, you'll see this in titles first in 2026. It's a pretty long time, actually. So it's not, it shouldn't then be an easy process. And the question is, why is it not an easy process?
Yeah. From my understanding, like PSSR was really built around the capabilities of the PS5 Pro to be as like fully fused as possible to stay on the on-die memory there. So that was like a significant issue for them. And I think when you look at FSR4, it's not even clear if FSR4 is fully a CNN model. There's some rumblings that it might have a transformer component, and getting that all accelerated in a performant manner on a PS5 Pro, which has this very bizarre hybrid architecture that's based in RDNA 2, but it has the RT performance from RDNA 4, has some elements from RDNA 3 as well. That's obviously a very complicated situation there. There are a lot of things we don't know ultimately, but I do think that that the time period that is being suggested here in terms of time to implement FSR4's neural network for PSSR certainly does suggest that they have a lot of work left to do. And indeed, they're kind of tentative about it, like it's their aim necessarily, but not necessarily something they're promising to end users.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the original announcement from AMD, it was excited for the co-development with Sony Interactive Entertainment on the models used for the FSR upscaler. So it does sound as though it was a widely, a wide collaboration as part of Amethyst. It seems pretty straightforward, right? Yeah, in terms of this scalability, I mean, the thing that struck me, Alex, was that it is quite a heavy computational load, FSR4. I mean, obviously, there is an acceleration element to it because you're operating from a lower resolution, right? But in terms of the question being asked here about, the 9050 and 9060, well, the simple solution to that is that you're likely to be upscaling to like 1080p or 1440p on those cards, right? Which means
Right.
that the computational cost drops way down on that. So it shouldn't be a problem. Where things become more interesting from my perspective is how this would work on a prospective handheld implementation or mobile iGPU implementation, let's say, for, an RDNA 4 based GPU, which, I think that's one of the key objectives that AMD has with FSR 4. Maybe it will be a different model, a lighter model. We've seen it work before. Who knows? But that's kind of the situation there.
Yeah.
But the TOPS situation there, I mean, Mark Cerny did seem to indicate that it's broadly comparable with these new cards. But that's quite interesting because these cards are considerably more capable than the PS5 Pro in all other aspects. So how that carries over to PlayStation, kind of need a bit more detail there, I think. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one comes from King Penumbra. Could it be that Nvidia put out the 5000 series knowing the performance uplift wasn't amazing, but banking on the next generation to be a larger node shrink? Sort of how 20 series to 30 series okay uplift was followed by the node shrink on 40 series. Well, they would have known that the performance uplift wasn't going to be amazing because they're on the same node. That fundamentally limits what you can do because you can't, squeeze more transistors on. You can't increase the amount of logic by any meaningful degree. So they would have known that, they were going to be quite limited in that regard. Quite interesting here how the 20 series to 30 series okay uplift. Sorry, the uplift is described as being okay when it was actually pretty huge. Awesome. Yeah. And it was done on what was effectively a 10 nanometer Samsung process that was kind of refined and rebranded to 8 nanometer. But yeah, I think we can safely assume that there will be a node change for 60 series and there will be a decent performance uplift there. But 50 series has just been kind of a bit weird and anemic from a hardware perspective, right, Alex?
Yeah, it's I don't want to say it's the most disappointing thing that Nvidia's put out in a while, but in terms of on the software side, I think it's been one of the more interesting ones they've had in a long time. It's just the hardware, the prices, and all the other, like, I've been having driver issues. I was just complaining to Rich before we came here. I actually was experiencing also the black screen issue on the RTX 5080, but I didn't know what it was. I thought I did something wrong, but it turns out that's a widespread issue. Like all these things that just compound into it. Regarding the question, though, I don't think it's like some sort of sleight of hand to like make the next series look better. I just think it was the technological, financial reality of the time that the process is not ready for them at this point within the schedule of all the other clients who want to use TSMC's work. So this is what we get. The question is, did it deserve like a full RTX 1000, upgrade in naming? Should they have pushed if they knew that the hardware was going to be most similar, should they have pushed also in other directions, like memory? Like they are pushing in memory speed, but they're not pushing in memory capacity. So I feel like they could have made this a more interesting lineup of GPUs just by pushing the hardware in also appreciable directions that didn't require a new process. And they didn't really do that.
Oliver?
Yeah, I don't really think they banked on anything. I think that's not quite correct. I think they just have a design that doesn't yield huge improvements for gaming. Obviously, Blackwell is meant for different audiences here, and the results in terms of efficiency for gaming aren't amazing. You're seeing similar die sizes, similar performance across the board. In some cases, actually less efficient designs in terms of wattage per frame rate, wattage per FPS there. I would expect the 60 series to have a larger uplift because of that 3 nanometer shrink, presumably. Hopefully 3 nanometers is a mature process by that point. I'd imagine they'd have like some 3N process, much the same as they have 4N now in terms of a customized NVIDIA process. But I also know that some of the early 3 nanometer products weren't that great, like my iPhone 15 Pro here. It had quite poor performance relative to expectations, was not actually that much faster than the previous generation product. So yeah, I'd hope that that would be a situation where you're looking at a more typical generational uplift, but I wouldn't expect it to be as large as something like going from the 30 series cards to the 40 series cards, where effectively we're getting 2 node jumps all at once, going straight to the 5 nanometer and 4 nanometer class hardware there. That was such a huge upgrade. I don't think we're going to see anything like that really here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to say what I've been saying in the past, which is to say that you're going to be seeing a lot more software driving quote unquote performance improvements. It's just the way it is, as the cost per transistor is not, scaling to anything like the sort of thing we saw previously. These big generational uplifts are getting more and more expensive. So, of course, we're going to be seeing this balance between software and hardware change. I think I said that in the 5090 review. The problem is that if you're going to be doing this via software, you need to have every game support those software innovations. We've kind of got there, I think, to a certain extent with DLSS super resolution. If a game ships now without DLSS, that's a problem, right? We haven't got there with frame generation. And we certainly haven't got there with ray reconstruction, which I think is crucially important as we move into the RT era more dramatically. So, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of implementation of software. But I do think that that's basically the direction of travel. And that's certainly what you're going to be seeing on consoles, which is why we've got stuff like Project Amethyst happening in the first place. And, Microsoft have their own AI endeavors happening behind the scenes, which from the gaming side, all we've seen so far is auto SR, really. And I guess auto HDR to a different degree. But, that's basically the direction of travel, because the concept of just scaling up GPUs is kind of like, you can do it, but you're going to have to pay through the nose to enjoy that, to get that extra traditional performance. But I would expect to see a new node for the next generation. And, there's a lot happening with actual competition, seemingly, Intel seemingly back in the game with their next process. And, just the concepts that you don't necessarily need to go to TSMC to fabricate your chips. That's probably going to be a good thing.
That'd be a good thing.
Yeah. But who knows? I think it has been a bit of a holding pattern for this particular generation. But I think absolutely we should consider, there could be a possibility that GPU gen-on-gen uplifts would be more like CPU gen-on-gen uplifts. I think that's a very real possibility, and it's going to upset a lot of people. But ultimately, you kind of need competition to drive innovation. But if both AMD and Nvidia are kind of on the same track, that kind of says that there's an external factor affecting it. And it probably is the fabrication side of things. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Octolima. Something that's been floating around my mind lately is, given the vast range of graphics games offer, it's entirely possible that platforms like the PS4 simply never go away. Nothing would stop a lightweight indie game, especially a 2D one, from running on it in 10 years or so. If the Steam Deck is the bar for current gen, in theory, last gen ports should always be possible, at least for this generation, no? Well, actually, I'm going to go to you, Oliver, on this one, because still in development is your Too Big for Steam Deck 2025 update.
Yes.
I think he's kind of right in the sense that, there are always going to be lightweight games that can run on older GPUs. There's nothing new in that, right? But there are definitely new games that don't run particularly well on the Steam Deck. And in terms of this PlayStation 4 comment, I think it's simply the case that people just have moved on from the PlayStation 4 to the PS5 or whatever, so there's no business case for making those games.
I think people have moved on, and I think ultimately, like, the age of the hardware is just a concern, whether that's a failure concern or whether that's just people throwing out that hardware. Obviously, if you have a PS5, there's very little reason to have a PS4, right? And as far as I understand it, most PS4 players aren't buying like the hottest new indie titles. They're playing Fortnite, they're watching Netflix, they're playing Warzone, they're doing these kinds of tasks. They tend to not be as invested in gaming as perhaps people who have newer console hardware and newer PC hardware. And also at some point, who knows when this will happen, but Sony may just flat out stop you from shipping games on PS4 on that storefront. Right now on the PS3 and Vita storefronts, you can access games, you can download them, you can buy them, but no developer or publisher has been able to add new games to those storefronts in years. I think like 5 or 6 years, quite a long time now. There's also some issues on the technical side, like newer versions of common commodity engines may drop support for these older systems. Certainly rendering systems in Unreal Engine 5, different systems are not supported on that class of hardware for more advanced games. And I'd also say that like even if you're dealing with really simple games, you have a lot of overhead in the PS5 and similar systems that can be useful, especially on the CPU side. Like it lets you operate, I'd imagine, at higher levels of abstraction, worry about optimization less for your simpler games. And you can do things probably, I mean, I'd presume, although it's not a great practice, but like shipping blueprints and games like that. Maybe there are some things you couldn't get away with on a PS4. You could get away with them on PS5. That ultimately is like conducive to having a healthier maybe development environment, to being able to ship games in a faster at a faster pace with hopefully with somewhat fewer people, things like this. And that's what having access to hardware that is much more powerful than your game might really need, that's what it's giving you. So I think there are some advantages to just sticking with the newer hardware there for sure.
Alex?
It's also one less headache, right? Another platform to support. I don't know. I feel like they already have to support enough if you're an indie dev, including things like Switch. You know, if you're going to be focusing on low power anyway, I think I'd rather hit that really broad audience rather than the probably more dwindling over time PS4 audience. So I think Oliver put that all together really well.
Yeah, essentially, there are some interesting examples. For example, the developers of No Man's Sky are actually still supporting the Xbox One X in a meaningful way by adding graphics features that are running on the new consoles, selected ones, but you know they're porting them over to the One X because it can do it. But the question is whether there's an audience for that, and the answer is probably not. And if you're talking about a sort of forever platform, then you know we're basically talking about the PC at that point. Where absolutely there's going to be indie games that will run on a 1060. You know, even the Tiny Glade was
it
ran pretty well on the 1060. Yeah. So that's my thought on that one. But yeah, and I think as we move into this sort of more PC-like era, certainly, you know, with Xbox seemingly embracing it, then cross-gen as a concept could just kind of like last for longer and longer and longer. But it's all going to come down to the games, right? Similar to what's happened on Steam Deck, where there are games that just don't really run well on it anymore. But there we go. Let's move on. Todd Weitzel has this question. What would you count as quote-unquote generational leaps for PC gaming, since it's generally a gradual incremental year-on-year improvement versus large-scale 5 to 8 year console lifespans? Interesting what you think on this, Alex. Typically, a generational leap is defined by something that the new product does that the old product cannot do. But the PS4, PS5 sort of generational leap was blurring the lines a bit. So I'm curious, what would be the equivalent on PC?
Well, similar things you might have found on console, but since it's more incremental in terms of how the updates were handled, it was a little bit more blurred. But it was, as you go back in time, it becomes less blurred because the hardware more rapidly advanced. So like DX8 to DX9 was huge, just a massive cutoff point in games. Games just would not run. Same with, you know, DX7 to DX8 was another thing. Games wouldn't run. DX6 to DX7 was very similar. But then as you get into DX9C and above, up to like DX, right before DX11, there was DX10, of course, but it was a feature set a lot of people didn't use. So there was this like really washy period during the Xbox 360 era where you still had DX9 games shipping quite far into that generation. And it was only at the end that DX11 tried to erase that, because they didn't want all the CPU overhead. Then I think throughout DX11, you know, I actually do think like hardware ray tracing was a massive cutoff point. And you see that now in titles are releasing that just don't work on an AMD RX 5700 XT, right? Don't work on the older tiering cards that lacked RT units. Games that I think Alan Wake 2, it doesn't work on cards with, it works now on cards with mesh shaders, but you really should be playing it on a card that supports mesh shaders. I think those are harder cutoff points, but just the time lag between development has been so long. On the CPU side of things, 64-bit was a big transition point. And sometimes, depending upon the game, the instruction set of your CPU, even in the 64-bit era, has been a hard cutoff point. A lot of games requiring instructions that do not work on CPUs that could technically run the game, but just won't because they didn't compile it for that, because they're positively ancient at this point. So I think there are some harder cutoffs, DX12, DX11, and then 64-bit, kind of there. Yeah. But SSDs have surprisingly not been such a big cutoff point as would have expected.
Yeah, interesting. I guess the last one would have been DX12 Ultimate. With the hardware RT support and all the other stuff. That's quite interesting, but that takes us back to 2018.
Yeah,
it's like 2025 now. It's well overdue. That I suspect there's probably going to be some machine learning style generational leap, but it will still be compatible with quite a lot of cards. Interesting. Any thoughts on this one, Oliver?
No, I'm just always thinking of things in terms of consoles. So to me, at least at this point, especially because consoles are basically just PCs, you can map console generations onto what a PC generation might look like for equivalent kind of mid-range class hardware. But I would say there's been a recent split in the capabilities of the Nvidia hardware versus everyone else, in terms of ray tracing, in terms of path tracing, in terms of machine learning performance and associated technologies. So, I could imagine looking back and saying, well, actually the PlayStation 5 generation might have been an 8-year generation, but if you look at comparable NVIDIA hardware, maybe it was only like a 4-year generation, until you were at the state where mid-range hardware was like at that PS6 level, perhaps. Who knows? Maybe we're there already in terms of the next console generation on NVIDIA hardware, but who knows there really. I think it's definitely involves judgment calls, but I'd try to map it onto console generations for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting that it's almost the case that the hardware is now coming before the actual enabling generational leap from the API side. Which is kind of nuts, right? Let's move on to the next question. This one from Paul Calamato. With the PC-centric direction that Microsoft is rumored to be heading towards when it comes to hardware, do you foresee the Xbox Series X becoming a highly sought-out retro console in the future if quote-unquote Xbox just became the branding for UI mode in Windows for PC handheld and console-like devices? Presumably the games library and licenses would all be left behind on the legacy consoles, leaving the Series X as the most capable system for accessing all of the content from the old console ecosystem. I think from one perspective, that's probably quite right, but more to the point from the idea of physical media. You're going to need it because, your Series S, it hasn't got a disk drive, right? So it kind of rules out being able to access all of your old 360 and OG Xbox games, right? The Series X does have the disk drive, so it can fulfill that task. However, I think the thing that maybe Paul Calamato is possibly overlooking here is the concept that, well, what if your Xbox library of console games will run on your PC in the future? On your PC-like device that Microsoft produces. That's almost certainly going to happen. The question is whether it would also happen to Windows more generally, because I think Microsoft are going to try and do something along that to make every PC an Xbox. That would be the direction of travel. But you do need to have access to that digital library in order to be able to compete with Steam, which is basically, again, the kind of software side of the forever platform that the PC is. Thoughts, Alex?
I see it exactly like you. I also really, though, want to see I think Series X will fill that niche for some people who have the box copies of Xbox games, like you just said. I do think the adorably all digital is the next Xbox.
Yes.
Like, they've been trying to do it since the Xbox One, and they kind of gotten there already. And that's just the final step, the fact that Xbox Series consoles haven't sold so well. So they're going to be all in on that digital future next time around. And I think that is a good place to have an Xbox Series X potentially if you still want to play those games. But I'm of the opinion that Microsoft's going to make a way to make it so that you carry your digital library at least up to onto the newer PC-like ecosystem, including Xbox 360 releases. Just not sure how they're doing it yet, but I hope it's pretty much as seamless as can hopefully be, with no ugly stream your Xbox 360 game option. I don't want that.
That would be outrageous. I mean, fundamentally, those emulators are software, which are running on an x86 processor with a Radeon GPU that's DX compliant. So I don't see why you couldn't do it.
Yeah,
and it
originally came out also during the Xbox One era when Xbox One was not even using DX12 yet. If you remember that, like there's like the mono driver, etc. If you go back in time, sorry, but like it was originally created at a time when it wasn't even completely low level. So this should be eminently portable to PC. Please bring that to PC, right?
Oliver, Xbox Series X retro console.
I don't think it'll be much of a retro console, just because if you have a next generation Xbox console and if it is able to run those games, but we're on Xbox One and Xbox Series and maybe even Xbox 360 and original Xbox in a performant manner, why would you keep around that hardware necessarily? I'm not sure, especially if it has full backwards compatibility with Xbox Series software, which is maybe a high bar, but if they could get it there, there isn't that much reason to stick with that older hardware. Like even in my case, looking at like a PS5, that basically is a complete encapsulation of the PS4 for gaming purposes, right? So if that's the case here, if the situation is comparable, I don't think they'll hold on to them.
It is basically the whole physical media question that needs to be solved, which the Series X would solve, but I think there needs to be some kind of all-encompassing solution for transferring those discs into your digital library. Otherwise, that makes things quite tricky, doesn't it? Let's move on to this next question from Helen X. Hello, exclamation point. Blessed Foundryman, exclamation point. I was really enamored by last week's discussion of new ways to review GPUs that focuses on showing off games running at their best. That and the brief discussion on upgrades had me wishing for you to produce maybe a whole series of videos showing off just how good games can look and be made to run when using optimized settings and even driver-level tricks, like the one-click overclocking in the new Nvidia app for low to mid-tier components we can actually find in stock at more reasonable prices. Also, for people looking for high-end components, I almost always find myself telling them to get a new display, since I find that a good HDR experience is worth at least 2 modern GPU generations of performance. 2 separate points there, really, Alex, but I'm still going to talk about it as the anti-benchmark concept. And it would involve us basically looking at GPUs in the way we look at the consoles. Obviously, we'd be in control of the features that would be used and not used, and the compromises that would need to be made instead of the developers. But we can use the developers' own optimization or settings choices to do the job there. And you can use features from Nvidia and AMD to produce a bespoke experience. I was thinking that but obviously there is going to be limitations there. You're going to be limited to 2, maybe 3 GPUs, and I think possibly the logical solution there would be Nvidia and its closest AMD equivalent, and then Nvidia and maybe the last generation card, or rather the generation card that's the likely upgrade vector.
Right.
So it would be 5070 versus 9070, and it would be 5070 versus 3070, I guess. And it would
to like the previous, like the second, like skip a generation.
Yeah, I mean it's very rare that people actually move on from one series to the next. right?
It is, yeah. I think that would be the
Realistically.
way to do it, because you need to show like what would you get out of value if you were to upgrade to one of these two things, and that's
Yep.
basically what it would say. It's also a little bit reminiscent to 4K on a budget. I was
Yeah.
just thinking, because you're trying to get the most out of a game, and like you would have I don't know how would you select the games though exactly.
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because there are going to be some games where, they maybe don't have support for those features,
Yeah, so mhm.
tricky. Yeah, there's a lot of thought that we need to put into that, but I do think there is some merit to the concept, because those features are just becoming more and more important. The problem is basically, what do you target? I mean, I would say, for 70 series products, let's say, since we're talking about 5070, you'd be talking about 1440p. You'd be talking about frame rates significantly in excess of 60 frames per second, but possibly not. Well, I guess multi-frame generation would make it happen, 165 FPS or whatever. Yeah, it's we need to put a bit more thought into it. But I'm curious about this concept of a new display being better than two modern GPU generations of performance. I can see the point, right? Because, those 4K 240 hertz monitors, they're pretty awesome, aren't they?
They're great.
They really
Oliver,
do look good.
though, it's interesting. I think, Oliver, you have like more of an affinity for screens than I do. Would you agree with the sentiment that is the equivalent of two GPU upgrades?
Well, I think it's not really. It's you're comparing along different axes. It's apple and oranges to me, but I do think that having a display that you really like, possibly a larger format display, or a display that can deliver really strong contrast ratios, good HDR experiences, and good brightness, those are all things that I'm kind of looking for. I think that can greatly improve the experience of playing a game. And I would definitely say, I would definitely prefer, let's say, Alan Wake 2 on PS5 on a really, really good display that I liked a lot versus Alan Wake 2 with path tracing on a display that was kind of mediocre or poor quality. I think that's definitely the case. So I think having that ideal display for you matters a lot, and could possibly matter a lot more than each additional margin of performance. But I think there also is something as a display that's good enough for your purposes. And perhaps that the margin between a mid-range television that might be, let's say, mini LED based, and the very highest end mini LED or OLED display might not make that much of a difference, right? It's about finding that a bit of that compromise point. But yeah, for sure, I would tend to agree actually that your choice in display can make definitely a bigger impact on your gameplay than some margin of a couple generations on your GPU.
Yeah, classic example of that from my perspective is if I go on vacation, what do I take? The Switch OLED. At one point, it was Switch OLED versus Steam Deck LCD. And I just took the Switch OLED, right? And the screen was definitely a big part of that decision. Of course, things changed when the Steam Deck OLED came along. Now I'll take that because you're getting more performance and you're getting a really awesome screen. So yeah, screen is definitely part of the graphics experience, no doubt about it. As to whether it can be quantified in terms of the amount of GPU generations, that's a bit trickier, I think. Okay, final question. This one from Ildar Nurislamov. One could say that by developing a bunch of proprietary technologies, Nvidia is pushing the industry forward, but in some ways it's also kind of sabotaging it. Let's talk about Reflex. I think tech like this shouldn't be proprietary. Its approaches should just be part of graphics APIs, and most games should be using it by default. Or am I missing something? It's a software thing, right? You have a video about Reflex, but it's still not clear what kind of magic it actually does. General terms like optimizing and reducing latency don't really explain the how, and why this can't be just the standard for all games. Would be awesome if you made a deeper, more technical video about Reflex, maybe with some guest devs, because right now it's a total mystery to me. Alex, what does Reflex do and how does it work?
So there is a great Battle Nonsense came out of hibernation at one point to do a video about when AMD tried to launch anti-lag and it was messed up, and he explained very, very well in that video how Reflex works and what makes it unique. And the thing that makes it unique is that it's doing like a whole bunch of things at once. One thing, it's capping the frame rate below your monitor's full refresh rate so that it never goes into VSync and then frame queuing, which occurs with VSync, because the GPU is going to keep working behind the scene and queuing up frames, which increases input latency right when you get into VSync territory, which is at the max refresh rate of your monitor. And so it prevents that. Then it also reduces the amount of frames that are being queued in general to just basically be like 1. So it's like double buffering almost in that aspect. But it's basically just reducing as much on the engine side as possible by reducing the amount of max frames that can be queued up. That's something you could technically do beforehand in your control panel, at least on the Nvidia side, and then AMD eventually added it as well too, with this like I forget what they call it. They have these new names for it. It's like auto low latency plus or something. It used to just be like a max queued frame option. But that technically can cause issues in games, by the way. It can make your frame times more erratic, just so you know. That is not like something that is just only good. That's one thing Reflex does, though. And another thing that it does is it tries to prevent your GPU from reaching max utilization. The reason for this is because it is a little bit confusing, but there's like a back pressure component to having the GPU being completely utilized. It'll actually increase latency if it is. So it wants to also keep your GPU from maxing out. And in which case, if it is below the refresh rate of your monitor, it will automatically reduce your frame rate below max utilization in your GPU. So your GPU will be sitting maybe around 90 to 96% instead of being full 99 or 100. And it's doing this combination of things in real time to make sure, like the automatic GPU utilization frame rate limiting is actually probably the magic sauce of Reflex, which makes it feel so good. And that is the one thing that is proprietary more than the other technologies. AMD had to come up with their own solution for that. I still haven't looked at Anti-Lag 2. It deserves a look from us in a latency piece. But I presume it's going to be trying to do something very similar, which is the whole purpose of it. Otherwise, why would they make it? But that is something that is proprietary. And arguably, though, I agree with you. I don't think that should be proprietary. I think DirectX needs to not be so slow. And it's just like, it's like a snowy landscape. It is constantly like little bits are moving here and there, but it's like not advancing too much over time. The landscape looks very similar. Right. DirectX feels like that a lot. And, you know, these are things when Reflex came out, Microsoft should have really, I mean, maybe they did. They should have been like, wow, you came up with an API to make it so that developers can easily reduce the latency in their game with a single-click option. This should be part of DirectX. And I really think it should. And I think that's with a lot of NVIDIA innovations. Maybe they're keeping it for themselves because they want this proprietary money machine, essentially. But also, I feel like at that point, it should be really... the like klaxons should be going off at Microsoft. Hey, we need to really push forward on our side, on the API side, to make a generic version of this then through our own research. Because, man, it's like right now we're only getting cooperative vector support like maybe at the tail end of this year, I guess, which is machine learning directly used in the graphics API. 2025. NVIDIA was already doing this in 2018, right? Like, it's like crazy, the timescale lag there. So yeah, I do agree with you fully, though, that I really wish things like Reflex were just straight up DirectX and not tied to NVIDIA.
Mm-hmm. Oliver, what do you make of this? I mean, it is basically somebody's got to drive standards forward, right? And it does seem to be used as a point of differentiation to sell GPUs, which is kind of like normal. But at the same time, you do want to see DirectX improving.
I'm happy if NVIDIA is pushing the state of graphics technology forward. I just want Microsoft to be following them closely with various DirectX features and API support and all that good stuff. I think what we've seen out of Reflex and Reflex 2 is also quite interesting as well. It doesn't really have any competing solution at the moment, but both those solutions are really, really compelling for reducing input latencies in games. Yeah, I'd love it if there was some vendor agnostic solution here. But unfortunately, that doesn't really seem to be the case. And I think Alex was a little bit exasperated with like the influx of new technologies that were shown at CES and the inevitable waiting for Microsoft to provide some kind of vendor agnostic solution that would allow people to run those technologies. I think might be waiting quite a while for some of that stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Do you think that Microsoft needs some of its own Project Amethyst style collaboration to basically ensure that the industry keeps up with the custom stuff that Nvidia is doing?
Yeah, I would love that. And it's going to be so ironic when all these Microsoft next gen titles come out with FSR4 on them, which is like a Sony thing, at that point, or whatever it's going to be called. Maybe they'll have a different name for it within their SDK. But I really wish they would do that, because it just always feels, I know they have to be this like middle person in between the IHVs, and they all have their own view of the future. But sometimes it's been like, like NVIDIA has been pushing for so long in the direction where it obviously needs to go. And now we're seeing this direction, finally, this kick up from AMD, but the APIs are still behind in a lot of ways. So I don't know. Yeah, you're right,
Okay.
Oliver. I was a little bit frustrated at CES when I was like, man, this is amazing tech. When's it coming to DirectX? I think I asked that a couple times.
Well, who knows is the answer for now. But that was the last question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. But please do consider the DF supporter program. It's key to what we do. You get high quality video downloads of everything we do, news updates from the team, early access to DF Direct Weekly and other stuff, the chance to help shape this show. It's crucial to our endeavors. But that's all from us for this week. And I guess we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.